Marcus Chen pushed through the revolving doors of Apex Technologies with his 7-year-old son Jamie clinging to his hand like a lifeline, and immediately felt every eye in the lobby turn toward them like they'd just tracked mud across someone's white carpet. The marble floors gleamed so bright, Marcus could practically see his reflection staring back at him, this tired single dad in his worn jeans and faded jacket that had seen better days 3 years ago, standing in the middle of what looked like the set of some corporate power fantasy, where everyone wore suits that cost more than his monthly rent. Jamie squeezed his hand tighter, and Marcus glanced down to see his son's eyes wide with the kind of nervousness that came from being somewhere you knew you didn't belong, the kind of feeling Marcus had been fighting his whole life, but thought he'd left behind until 6 months ago when everything fell apart. The receptionist, a woman with hair pulled back so tight it probably gave her headaches, looked up from her computer screen with the kind of smile that wasn't really a smile at all, more like a professional arrangement of facial muscles designed to say, "I'm being polite, but please state your business and leave." Marcus cleared his throat and stepped forward, trying to ignore the whispers from the cluster of executives near the elevator bank, their eyes sliding over him with that particular brand of dismissal reserved for people who look like they couldn't afford to be there. "I'm here to see Victoria Grant," he said, keeping his voice steady even though his heart was hammering against his ribs like it wanted out. The receptionist's eyebrows climbed so high they nearly disappeared into her hairline, and she actually leaned back in her chair like he'd just announced he was there to rob the place. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, her fingers already moving toward the phone like she was ready to call security, and Marcus felt Jamie press closer against his leg, probably picking up on the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. "No, but she'll want to see me." Marcus, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out the envelope that arrived at his apartment 3 days ago, the one with the Apex Technologies logo embossed in gold on the back, the one that had turned his world upside down all over again when he'd opened it and read the contents. The receptionist took the envelope like it might explode, opened it with manicured nails that clicked against the paper, and Marcus watched her face transform from dismissive to shocked to professionally neutral in about 5 seconds flat. She picked up the phone immediately, spoke in low tones he couldn't quite catch, then hung up and looked at him with new eyes, the kind that held calculation instead of dismissal. "Ms. Grant will see you," she said, standing up and gesturing toward the elevator bank. "Take the private elevator to the top floor. Someone will meet you there." Marcus nodded, took Jamie's hand again, and headed toward the elevator marked Executive Access Only, feeling the weight of every stair following them across that gleaming lobby. The elevator was the kind with mirrors on every wall, and as they rode up, Marcus caught sight of himself and Jamie reflected into infinity, this single dad and his scared kid heading into the lion's den, and he wondered for the 100th time if he was doing the right thing coming here. The elevator doors opened onto a floor that made the lobby look modest, all floor-to-ceiling windows with views of the city stretching out like a kingdom, sleek furniture that probably cost more than his car, and original artwork on the walls that Marcus recognized from magazines he couldn't afford to buy. A woman in a sharp suit materialized from nowhere and led them down a hallway where their footsteps were swallowed by carpet so thick it felt like walking on clouds, past offices where people sat behind desks, the size of Marcus's entire living room, until finally they stopped in front of double doors made of dark wood that looked like they'd been carved by someone who charged by the hour. The woman knocked twice, waited for a response Marcus couldn't hear, then opened the doors and gestured them inside. The office beyond was exactly what Marcus had imagined and somehow worse, a space designed to intimidate with its size and luxuries, and there behind a desk that could have doubled as a landing strip sat Victoria Grant, CEO of Apex Technologies, youngest woman to ever run a fortune, and the woman who'd just sent Marcus a letter claiming his late wife had sold her the rights to an algorithm Marcus had spent 5 years developing, an algorithm that was now powering half of Apex's most profitable product. Victoria Grant didn't stand when they entered, which Marcus figured was probably some power move she'd learned at whatever business school pumped out people who thought money made them gods, and instead she just leaned back in her chair, that probably cost what Marcus made in 6 months, and studied them with eyes that reminded him of a hawk sizing up prey. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe 35, with dark hair pulled into a style that probably had a name he didn't know, and features that would have been beautiful if they weren't arranged into an expression of pure calculated amusement, like she was watching a show she'd already seen, but was willing to watch again because the ending was always satisfying. "Marcus Chen," she said, and her voice had that quality of someone used to being heard, every word precisely placed like chess pieces on a board. "I'd say I'm surprised to see you, but that would be a lie. I've been expecting this visit since the moment my lawyers sent that letter." Jamie shifted behind Marcus's leg, and Victoria's eyes flicked down to the boy with something that might have been interest or might have been calculation. Marcus couldn't tell which. "And you brought your son, how touching, trying to appeal to my maternal instincts perhaps." Marcus felt anger flash hot in his chest but kept his voice level because losing his temper wouldn't help anything, and this woman already had all the power in the room. "That algorithm belongs to me. I developed it over 5 years while working freelance. Sarah had no right to sell it to you." Victoria's smile widened like she'd been waiting for exactly this opening, and she pulled out a manila folder from her desk drawer with the kind of flourish that said she'd done this before. "Your wife signed a contract 3 months before her death, perfectly legal and notarized, selling all intellectual property rights to anything developed during your marriage, for a sum that frankly was quite generous considering the circumstances. My lawyers have already verified everything, and I assure you, Mr. Chen, this algorithm is mine." The words hit Marcus like physical blows because Sarah had been sick those last months, in and out of hospitals with treatments that drained their savings faster than water through a sieve, and the thought that she'd sold his work without telling him, probably desperate for money to pay medical bills, made his heart ache with a grief that had never really gone away. "She was dying," Marcus said quietly, and he hated how his voice cracked on that word. "She wasn't thinking clearly. You took advantage of someone desperate." Victoria stood now, walking around her desk with movements that were too controlled to be natural, like she choreographed everything she did, and stopped a few feet away studying Marcus with new intensity. "I did no such thing. Your wife approached me with an offer and I accepted it. Business is business, Chen. Surely you understand that. But I'll admit I'm curious about something. You're clearly here because you think you can somehow reverse this transaction, so tell me, what exactly did you think would happen when you walked into my office?" Marcus had rehearsed this moment in his head 100 times since receiving that letter, imagined all the ways he might convince her, or threaten her, or appeal to her better nature if she had one. But standing there in that office with Jamie behind him and this woman in front of him like some final boss in a game he'd never learned to play, all those rehearsed words evaporated. "I want it back," he said simply. "That algorithm was my life's work. It was supposed to be Jamie's future, his college fund, his security when I'm gone. I'm not asking for charity, I'm asking for what's rightfully mine." Victoria laughed, actually laughed, a sound that had no humor in it whatsoever. "Let me make something clear to you. That algorithm has already generated $40 million in revenue for Apex Technologies. We've integrated it into 7 different products and have plans for 12 more. I couldn't give it back even if I wanted to, which I don't. So unless you have something to offer me that's worth more than $40 million and climbing, I suggest you take your son and go home." Marcus felt Jamie's hand slip into his, felt his son trembling, and something hardened inside him because this woman could take his work and his money, and his future, but she couldn't take his dignity. "Chess," he said suddenly, the word coming out before he'd fully thought it through. Victoria blinked, the first crack in her perfect composure. "Excuse me." Marcus pointed to the antique chess set displayed on a shelf behind her desk, the pieces carved from what looked like ivory and obsidian, probably worth more than his car and his apartment combined. "You play. I can tell by the way that set is positioned, not just decoration but actually used. So here's my offer. Play me in chess, 1 game. If I win you give me back the rights to my algorithm. If you win I walk away and never bother you again." The silence that followed was so complete Marcus could hear the city humming 40 floors below, could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, could hear Jamie's breathing behind him, and then Victoria's face transformed into something predatory. "You're serious," she said, and when Marcus nodded she actually smiled, a real smile this time full of teeth. "Beat me in chess and I'm yours," she said, and the way she phrased it made it sound like more than just the algorithm was at stake. "But I should warn you, Mr. Chen, I've been playing since I was 5. I was state champion in high school and I've never lost a meaningful game in my life. Are you sure you want to do this?" Marcus pulled out the chair across from Victoria's desk where she'd cleared a space, and set up the antique chess set, each piece clicking against the marble board with sounds that felt louder than they should, and he tried to ignore the way his hands wanted to shake because this was possibly the stupidest thing he'd ever done, but also the only move he had left. Victoria sat across from him looking like she'd already won, that smirk still playing at the corners of her mouth, and gestured to Jamie, who was hovering uncertainly near the office door. "Your son can sit in that chair by the window. I imagine this won't take long, but he might as well be comfortable while he watches his father lose." Marcus bit back a response and nodded to Jamie, who scurried over to the leather chair that swallowed him up, his legs dangling off the edge, eyes wide with the kind of trust that made Marcus's chest tight, because kids believed their parents could do anything until the world taught them otherwise. "White or black?" Victoria asked, her fingers already moving toward the board like she couldn't wait to start, and Marcus considered the question, knowing that white moved first, which was an advantage but also meant showing his strategy immediately. "Black," he said, figuring he might as well see what she did before committing to anything. Victoria's eyes flickered with something that might have been approval or might have been amusement, hard to tell with her, and she turned the board so she had the white pieces arranged in front of her like soldiers ready for war. The first moves were textbook, Victoria opening with pawn to e4, which was classic and aggressive, Marcus responding with the Sicilian defense, because it was solid and gave him options, and for the first 10 minutes they traded pieces and positioning like two people feeling each other out, testing for weaknesses, looking for openings. Victoria played fast, her moves coming without hesitation like she'd memorized every possible response, and Marcus realized she wasn't just good, she was exceptional, the kind of player who saw the board not as it was but as it would be 5 or 10 moves ahead, each piece positioned not for immediate gain but for future advantage. Marcus forced himself to slow down, to really look at the board, and as he studied the position, something his grandfather had told him years ago surfaced in his mind. This old Chinese man, who'd taught Marcus chess in a community center that smelled like old books and floor wax, who'd always said that the best players weren't the ones who saw the most moves but the ones who understood what their opponent wanted. Marcus looked up from the board to Victoria's face and saw it written there clear as day. She wasn't just trying to win, she was trying to dominate, to crush him so thoroughly there'd be no question who was superior. And that arrogance was a weakness, because players who needed to dominate made different choices than players who just needed win. "Your wife talked about you," Victoria said suddenly, moving her knight to a square that threatened Marcus's bishop. "Those last weeks before she died, when we were negotiating the contract, she told me you were brilliant but naive, that you believed in things like honor and fairness, that the world had never taught you how it really worked." Marcus moved his bishop to safety and tried to ignore the way hearing about Sarah from this woman's mouth felt like violation. She was dying, she said things she didn't mean. Victoria captured one of Marcus's pawns with her rook, a sacrifice that opened up her queen's diagonal in a way that would have been brilliant if Marcus hadn't seen it coming 3 moves ago. "Oh, she meant them. She loved you, Miss Chen. That much was obvious. But she also knew you'd never agree to sell that algorithm, because you attached meaning to it beyond its monetary value, so she did what she thought was necessary to secure her son's future. She was practical in a way you've never been." Marcus felt anger building but channeled it into focus, studying the board with new intensity, because Victoria was good but she was also talking, which meant she was trying to distract him, and that meant she wasn't as confident as she appeared. He moved his queen to b6, a quiet move that didn't threaten anything immediately but repositioned his most powerful piece to where it needed to be. "Maybe she was right," Marcus said, keeping his voice neutral. "Maybe I am naive, maybe the world doesn't work the way I think it should, but you know what I've learned being a single dad raising a kid alone. Sometimes the naive choice is the only one you can live with." Victoria's smirk faltered for just a second before returning full force, and she moved her queen to attack his knight. Beautiful sentiment, truly, but sentiment doesn't win chess games and it doesn't win in business. "Now are you going to play or are you going to philosophize?" Marcus moved his knight and the game continued as afternoon light faded outside those massive windows and the office slowly filled with shadows that made the chess pieces look like they were carved from darkness itself. 20 moves in and Victoria's smirk had faded into concentration, her moves coming slower now as she studied the board with eyes that had lost their predatory gleam and gained something that looked uncomfortably close to concern, and Marcus felt something shift in the air between them, like the moment in a storm when the wind changes direction. He'd been playing defense this whole time, careful and conservative, absorbing her attacks and giving ground strategically, letting her think she was winning, while slowly repositioning his pieces into a formation his grandfather had taught him called the patient dragon, a setup that looked weak until suddenly it wasn't. Victoria captured another of his pawns with her bishop, a move that opened up the center of the board in a way that should have been decisive, and she glanced up at Marcus with an expression that was trying to recapture that earlier confidence but couldn't quite manage it. "You're better than I expected," she admitted, which was probably the closest thing to a compliment he'd get from her, "but you're still losing. You've sacrificed too much material, and your king position is weak. Another 5 moves and I'll have checkmate." Marcus moved his rook to d1, and the click of the piece on marble felt louder than it should in the quiet office where the only other sound was Jamie's breathing and the distant hum of the city below. "Maybe," he said, not looking up from the board, "or maybe you're so focused on attack you haven't noticed your own king is exposed." Victoria's eyes snapped back to the board, and Marcus watched her face as she recalculated, saw the moment she realized that his last 3 moves hadn't been defensive at all, but set up his pieces arranged now in a pattern that controlled the dark squares and left her king with nowhere safe to go, and her hand froze halfway to her queen. The silence stretched out like taffy, and then Victoria actually leaned back in her chair studying Marcus with new eyes. "Where did you learn to play like this?" she asked, and there was genuine curiosity in her voice now stripped of that earlier condescension. Marcus thought about his grandfather, about those afternoons in the community center where old men played chess and told stories and taught kids like Marcus that the game wasn't about being the smartest or the fastest, but about understanding patterns and patience. "Someone who believed games were about more than winning," Marcus said, and moved his knight to e5. Victoria stared at the board for a long moment, and Marcus could actually see her running through possibilities in her head, her eyes flicking from piece to piece as she calculated variations, and with each passing second her expression grew tighter. She moved her queen to safety, a defensive move that Marcus's grandfather would have called the first crack in the fortress, and Marcus pressed his advantage by bringing his other rook into play. Jamie had moved from his chair to stand beside Marcus now, his small hand resting on his father's shoulder, and Marcus reached up to squeeze it briefly, because win or lose he wanted his son to see him try. "This algorithm," Victoria said suddenly, her eyes still on the board. "Your wife told me about it before she sold it. She said you developed it to help people, some kind of medical imaging software that could detect diseases earlier than current technology. Is that true?" Marcus moved his queen to c7, putting Victoria's king in check and forcing her to move, and nodded without looking up. "That was the idea. I worked with doctors at the free clinic where Sarah was treated, saw how many people came in too late because they couldn't afford early screening, thought if I could develop something that made the process faster and cheaper, it might save lives." Victoria moved her king to the only safe square left, and Marcus could see her calculating the endgame now, see her realizing that she was running out of moves. "And instead I bought it and turned it into a profit center," she said, and there might have been something like regret in her voice, but Marcus couldn't be sure. "We're charging hospitals premium prices to license the technology, making millions while people who need it most still can't afford access. That's what you're really angry about, isn't it? Not just that I bought the rights, but what I did with them." Marcus looked up from the board and met her eyes, saw something there he hadn't expected, an intelligence that went beyond chess moves and business deals, a person who maybe understood more than she wanted to admit. "You turned something meant to help people into another way to extract money from a broken system," Marcus said quiet. "So yeah, I'm angry, but mostly I'm sad because Sarah died believing she was securing Jamie's future when really she was just feeding a machine that doesn't care about futures or kids or anything except quarterly earnings." The words hung in the air between them, and Victoria's hand hovered over her bishop before pulling back, and Marcus realized she was stalling because she'd seen it too, seen that there was no way out, that in 3 more moves Marcus would have checkmate and the game would be over. Victoria stared at the board like it had personally betrayed her, her fingers drumming against the armrest of her chair in a rhythm that betrayed nerves. Marcus didn't think she was capable of feeling, and he waited because there was nothing left to do but wait. As she worked through every possible move and found each one wanting, she tried moving her knight, but Marcus's bishop controlled those squares, tried advancing a pawn but his rook made that suicidal, tried repositioning her queen but that only delayed the inevitable by 1 move, and finally her hand dropped to her lap, and she let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for about 1,000 years. "I don't lose," she said, and it wasn't arrogance this time, just statement of fact, like she was trying to reconcile reality with her understanding of how the world worked. "I haven't lost a meaningful game since I was 16 years old. I've played grandmasters and held my own, beaten CEOs and investors, and every arrogant man who thought he could use chess as a way to diminish me, and now I'm about to lose to a broke single dad in worn jeans, who looks like he can barely afford his next meal." Marcus almost smiled at that, because there was something almost human in her frustration, something vulnerable that the armor of power and position had hidden. "My grandfather used to say that losing taught you more than winning ever could," Marcus offered, watching her face for reaction. "Though I imagine that's easier to believe when you're the one winning." Victoria looked up at him with eyes that held genuine curiosity now, all the earlier calculation burned away by the reality of impending defeat. "Who was your grandfather?" she asked, and Marcus could tell she was stalling but also actually wanted to know. Jamie squeezed his shoulder and Marcus covered his son's hand with his own before answering. "He was nobody important by your standard. Janitor who came to America with nothing and worked his whole life, cleaning office buildings, probably a lot like this one, but he taught me chess in a community center on Saturdays, and he taught me that the game was about seeing patterns and understanding what your opponent needed." Victoria moved her king even though they both knew it changed nothing, and the click of the piece on marble sounded like a bell tolling. "And what do I need?" she asked, her voice softer than it had been all evening. Marcus considered the question, really thought about it, because this woman wasn't just some cartoon villain despite how he'd wanted to see her that way. She was a person who'd clawed her way to the top of a brutal system and learned to survive by being harder and sharper than everyone around her. "Same thing everyone needs," he said finally, "to feel like what you're doing matters, like you're not just another cog in a machine that grinds people up and spits them out, but you've spent so long winning that you forgot winning isn't the same as matter." Victoria laughed, a real laugh this time that had actual emotion in it, and she shook her head like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "You're going to lecture me about meaning while sitting in my office about to take back an algorithm I paid $2 million for? That's Marcus moved his queen to L8, and the position was undeniable now. Checkmate in 2 moves no matter what she did. "I'm not lecturing, I'm answering your question," he said. "And yeah, I'm about to win this game. But that doesn't mean I don't understand why you are the way you are. The world taught you that everything's a transaction, and the person with the most wins gets to write the rules. But my grandfather taught me something different. He taught me that the best games are the ones where both players learn something." Victoria stared at the board for what felt like forever, and Marcus watched thoughts race across her face like clouds across sky, saw her pride warring with something else, maybe respect or maybe just exhaustion with the constant battle of always needing to be the smartest person in the room. She reached out slowly and tipped her king over, the traditional gesture of resignation, and the hollow sound it made falling against the marble board felt like the end of something bigger than just a chess game. "Checkmate," she said quietly, and then louder. "You win, Chen. The algorithm is yours. I'll have my lawyers draw up the paperwork transferring the rights back to you by end of business tomorrow." Jamie let out a whoop of joy that echoed in the quiet office, throwing his arms around Marcus's neck, and Marcus held his son tight, feeling relief and exhaustion, and something else he couldn't quite name wash over him in waves. But Victoria wasn't done talking. She was leaning back in her chair studying Marcus with an expression that was hard to read in the dim office light. "I have a proposition for you," she said, and Marcus tensed because he'd learned the hard way that propositions from powerful people usually came with catches. "What kind of proposition?" Victoria stood and walked to those massive windows overlooking the city, a silhouette dark against the glittering lights of downtown, spreading out like stars fallen to earth, and she stood there for so long, Marcus almost thought she'd forgotten they were in the room until she spoke without turning around. "When I bought your algorithm, I legitimately thought I was making a smart business decision. Acquire promising technology at a bargain price from someone desperate enough to sell, integrate it into our existing products, maximize profit margins. That's how this world works, Mr. Chen. That's how I've always operated, and it's made me very successful." Jamie had climbed into Marcus's lap now, tired from the tension and the late hour, and Marcus wrapped his arms around his son while watching Victoria's reflection in the glass. But, Marcus prompted, because he could hear there was a but coming. Victoria turned and leaned against the window, her face half in shadow. But lately I've been wondering what the point of all this success actually is. I'm 36 years old. I run a Fortune 500 company. I have more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes, and I go home every night to an empty apartment and eat takeout alone, because I've spent so much time winning that I forgot to build anything else. There was something raw in her voice that Marcus hadn't expected, a vulnerability that felt almost painful to witness, and he found himself seeing her differently, not as the villain who'd stolen his work, but as another person trying to navigate a world that didn't make sense. Your wife told me something before she died, Victoria continued, coming back to sit at her desk, but different now, less like a CEO and more like a person. She said that you developed that algorithm because you believed technology should serve people, not profit, that you'd spent 5 years working nights and weekends to create something that could actually save lives, and she cried when she told me because she knew selling it to me meant betraying everything you believed in, but she was desperate and dying, and terrified of leaving Jamie with nothing. Marcus felt his throat tighten because hearing about Sarah's last days from someone who'd been there, who'd witnessed her desperation and fear, made the loss fresh again, like ripping a scab off a wound that had never properly healed. She asked me to promise something, Victoria said, her eyes meeting Marcus's directly. She made me promise that if you ever came looking for the algorithm, if you ever figured out what she'd done and came to try to get it back, that I would give you a choice, let you decide what happened next instead of just taking the money and walking away like she knew you'd want to do. Marcus adjusted Jamie in his lap, his son's weight warm and solid against his chest. What kind of choice? Victoria pulled out a leather folder from her desk and slid it across to Marcus, and he opened it with one hand to find legal documents dense with text he'd need hours to properly understand. Option 1 is simple, Victoria said. I give you back the full rights to your algorithm. You walk out of here and do whatever you want with it. Sell it to someone else. Give it away. Use it however you think best. I keep the money I already paid your wife because that's legally mine, but the future of the technology is yours. She paused and Marcus looked up from the documents. Option 2 is more complicated. You and I form a partnership. You become Chief Technical Officer at Apex Technologies, with full control over how your algorithm is developed and deployed. I provide the resources and infrastructure of a Fortune 500 company. You provide the vision and integrity. We turn this thing into what you originally wanted it to be, affordable, accessible medical technology that actually saves lives. And we both walk away from this having built something that matters instead of just something that makes money. Marcus stared at her, trying to determine if this was genuine or just another play, another way for her to maintain control, but he couldn't read her face in the dim light, and his instincts were scrambled from exhaustion and emotion. Why would you offer me that? He asked carefully. What do you get out of it besides someone telling you what you're doing wrong? Victoria smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes for the first time all evening. Maybe I'm tired of being the villain in everyone else's story, she said. Maybe your wife's death and her last request and watching you beat me at chess while teaching your son what integrity looks like made me realize I've spent 15 years building an empire but forgot to build anything worth having. Maybe I'm selfish enough to want redemption and smart enough to know I can't do it alone. Jamie stirred in Marcus's arms and mumbled something about being hungry, and Marcus kissed the top of his son's head while his mind raced through possibilities and consequences, trying to see the trap if there was one, but also trying to imagine what Sarah would want him to do. Marcus stood with Jamie sleeping in his arms, the weight of his son both literal and metaphorical, this 7-year-old life that depended on every decision Marcus made, and he looked from the documents on Victoria's desk to the woman herself standing there, in her expensive office with her expensive view and her offer that sounded too good to be true, because things that sounded too good to be true usually were. I need some conditions, Marcus said finally, and Victoria nodded like she'd been expecting this. I need complete control over pricing and distribution. The technology has to be affordable for clinics and hospitals that serve underserved communities, not just premium medical centers that cater to people with good insurance. I need that in writing with no loopholes. Victoria pulled out a pen and a legal pad and started writing, her movements quick and efficient. Done. What else? Marcus shifted Jamie to his other arm and continued. I need final say on any partnerships or licenses involving the algorithm. No selling the technology to companies that will just lock it behind paywalls or use it to deny coverage. And I need transparency, quarterly reports on where the technology is being used and who's benefiting. No hiding behind corporate confidentiality. Victoria kept writing, and Marcus could see her mind working through implications, but she didn't argue or push back. Reasonable. Continue. Marcus took a breath because this next part was the one that mattered most, and I need you to set up a foundation using profits from the algorithm, specifically dedicated to covering medical costs for families like mine, people who fall through the cracks of the insurance system, people who end up in the position Sarah was in, where they have to choose between their principles and survival. I want the thing we build to help them. Victoria stopped writing and looked up, and in her eyes Marcus saw something that might have been the beginning of understanding, or maybe just the end of resistance. That would cost millions, she said, but not as an objection, more like she was calculating. Tens of millions if we do it right. It would significantly impact our profit margins. Marcus met her gaze steadily. Then I guess you need to decide if you meant what you said about wanting to build something that matters, or if this is just another way for you to feel better about doing business as usual. Because I'm not interested in window dressing, I'm interested in actual change, the kind that makes my son's generation ask why we ever did things any other way. The silence in the office was so complete Marcus could hear his own heartbeat, could hear Jamie's soft breathing against his shoulder, could hear the city humming 40 floors below, full of people trying to survive systems that weren't designed for them. Victoria set down her pen and walked around her desk until she was standing directly in front of Marcus, close enough that he could see the tiredness in her eyes that her makeup almost hid, could see the calculating expression replaced by something more honest. When I was 23 I had a choice, she said quietly. I could take a job at a non-profit working on clean water initiatives in developing countries. Salary would have been $30,000 a year, and I would have spent my life making actual tangible differences in people's lives. Or I could take a position at a tech startup that eventually became Apex. Salary was triple and the potential for more was unlimited. I chose the money and told myself I could always do the meaningful work later once I'd secured my financial future. She paused and Marcus saw something like regret flicker across her face. But later never comes, does it? There's always another promotion, another acquisition, another quarter to beat, and before you know it you're 36 and you've built this massive successful thing, but you can't remember the last time you did something that made you feel like a good person. Marcus adjusted his grip on Jamie and considered his response carefully because he could feel they were at some kind of turning point. My grandfather used to say that the second best time to plant a tree is today, he said. First best time was 20 years ago, but since we can't go back we might as well start now. Victoria actually smiled at that, a genuine expression that transformed her face into something softer. Your grandfather sounds like he was a wise man. Marcus nodded. He would have told me that people deserve second chances even when they don't think they deserve them. So here's what I'll do. I'll accept your offer with all the conditions I stated. We'll form this partnership and try to build something Sarah would have been proud of. But I need you to understand that if you go back on any of this, if you try to turn this into another profit extraction scheme, I'll walk away and take the algorithm with me and you'll have lost something more valuable than money. Victoria extended her hand and Marcus shifted Jamie slightly so he could shake it, her grip firm and her eyes steady. Deal, she said. And Mr. Chen, thank you for giving me the chance to be better than I've been. I won't waste. Marcus shook her hand and felt something shift in his chest. Not quite trust but maybe the possibility of it. And as he carried his sleeping son toward the office door Victoria called after him. Marcus, she said, using his first name for the first time all evening. Your wife made me promise one more thing. She made me promise that if we ever worked together I'd make sure Jamie was taken care of. Education fund, healthcare, everything. She wanted to know that even if she couldn't be there, her sacrifice would mean he'd have opportunity. So that's part of this deal too, whether you like it or not. Marcus felt tears sting his eyes but blinked them away because he'd cried enough over Sarah's death and maybe it was time to honor her memory by actually living. She would have liked you, he said. Eventually, after she got past being furious about the whole buying her husband's work thing, Victoria laughed and it sounded almost carefree. I would have liked her too. Anyone who loved you and Jamie that much and was practical enough to do what needed doing even when it broke her heart. That's someone worth knowing. Marcus nodded and turned toward the elevator, and as the doors closed on Victoria's office with her standing there in the dim light looking smaller somehow, and more human, he looked down at Jamie sleeping against his shoulder and whispered, "We did it, buddy. We actually did." The community health clinic in East Oakland didn't look like much from the outside, just another low building with worn paint and a parking lot that needed resurfacing, but inside the waiting room was packed with people who 6 months ago wouldn't have been able to afford the kind of early disease screening that might save their lives, and Marcus Chen stood near the reception desk watching the intake coordinator explain the new imaging system to an elderly woman who kept saying, "And this really only costs $20, like she couldn't believe it. Victoria Grant stood beside him, and if someone had told Marcus 6 months ago that he'd be comfortable enough with this woman to stand in companionable silence while watching their joint project actually work, he would have laughed in their face, but here they were, this odd partnership that had somehow transformed both of them. "Mrs. Rodriguez is our 100th patient this week," Victoria said, nodding toward the elderly woman. "The algorithm has already flagged 3 early-stage cancers that would have gone undetected for months or years with traditional screening, 3 people who now have fighting chances they wouldn't have had." Marcus felt something warm spread through his chest, the feeling of work that actually mattered, and he thought about Sarah and hoped wherever she was she could see this, see what her desperate sacrifice had ultimately created. "The board is still furious with you," he said, glancing at Victoria, who'd taken more heat than she'd probably expected for restructuring Apex's entire medical technology division around affordable access instead of maximum profit. Victoria shrugged, a gesture that would have been unthinkable from the woman he'd met 6 months ago. "The board can be furious all they want. Our stock price is actually up because it turns out investors like companies that aren't completely soulless, who knew." She smiled, and Marcus found himself smiling back because they'd developed this rhythm over the past months, this partnership built on chess game stakes and shared purpose that had surprised them both. Jamie came running over from where he'd been playing with other kids in the clinic's childcare corner, his face bright with excitement. "Dad, Miss Chen showed me how the computer finds the sick spots. It's like really smart hide and seek." Marcus ruffled his son's hair and caught Victoria's eye. "Miss Chen has been teaching you a lot apparently." Victoria had taken to spending time with Jamie during the long hours they worked together, and watching this high-powered CEO patiently explain medical imaging to a 7-year-old was one of those things Marcus never would have predicted, but had come to treasure. "He's a smart kid," Victoria said. "Reminds me of his father. Asks questions that make you think about what you're really doing and why." The clinic director, Dr. Patel, emerged from the back with a tablet showing statistics that made Marcus's heart soar. Detection rates up 40%, costs down 60%, patient satisfaction through the roof, and they'd barely scratched the surface of what was possible. "You two have changed lives," Dr. Patel said, her eyes bright with the kind of passion Marcus had only seen in people who'd devoted themselves to serving others. "This technology, this model, this is what healthcare should look like, and I have colleagues in 12 other cities asking how they can implement the same system." Victoria looked at Marcus with raised eyebrows. 12 cities, that's going to require significant scaling. Think we can handle it? Marcus thought about the journey that had brought them here, about a desperate gamble on a chess game, and a woman who'd been brave enough to accept defeat in a partnership that had somehow become something neither of them expected, but both of them needed. "I think we better," he said. "Sarah would haunt me if we stopped now." They spent another hour at the clinic watching the algorithm work, meeting patients whose lives were being changed by technology that did what Marcus had always intended, served people instead of profit. And as they walked out into the afternoon sunshine with Jamie between them holding both their hands like they were some kind of unconventional family unit, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt since before Sarah got sick. He felt hope. "Same time next week?" Victoria asked as they reached the parking lot, and Marcus nodded because these clinic visits had become their ritual, their way of remembering why they did what they did when the corporate meetings and legal negotiations threatened to make them forget. "Same time next week," he confirmed. "And Victoria, thank you for keeping your promises, for being willing to change, for giving me and Jamie a future that actually means something." Victoria's eyes got a little misty and she quickly put on her sunglasses. "Thank you for beating me at chess," she said. "Turns out losing that game was the best thing that ever happened to me." They went their separate ways, Victoria to her car that probably cost more than Marcus's annual salary, and Marcus to his used sedan with the check engine light that wouldn't turn off. But somehow the gap between their worlds felt smaller now, bridged by shared purpose and the memory of a chess game where both players won something more valuable than victory. Marcus buckled Jamie into his car seat and his son looked up at him with Sarah's eyes. "Mom would be proud, right, Dad?" Jamie asked, and Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Yeah, buddy," he managed. "I think she would be really proud of all of us." As Marcus drove away from the clinic, he caught sight of Victoria in his rearview mirror, still standing by her car looking at the building like she was memorizing it, and he thought about how people could change when given the right reasons and the right chances, how the world didn't have to be the brutal transactional place they'd both learned to navigate, how sometimes the naive choice really was the only one you could live with, and he smiled because for the first time in years the future looked bright.